And from the United States to Europe, turmoil over the economy in the Eurozone as the heads of state gather in Brussels today to tackle the problem of a likely Greek default. Fears that a default in the country could send shock waves throughout Europe, starting a domino effect that would subsequently sink the economies of Italy, France, and even reach here in the U.S. The IMF now considering coming to the rescue and contributing to the EU bailout. But what are the consequences of a Greek default, and how can the economic downfall in the Eurozone affect the already troubled economy here in the U.S.? Well, to help me answer these questions, joining me now here in studio is Edward Harrison, founder of Credit Write-Downs. Edward, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
So first off, if there is a default, what will the impact be?
The impact will, in the first instance, be on the banks and the creditors of Greece, primarily banks like the Greek banks, and also it will be insurance companies, mostly throughout Europe in places like France and Germany.
And if there were to be a default, what would that mean for us here in the U.S.?
Well, I think my view is that a default would mean that Greece would actually have more fiscal space going forward. Right now, they have to undertake enormous austerity in order to make ends meet, and a default would actually mean that that austerity would be less. And so as a result, the negative impact of cutting government spending would be lessened. The question is, you know, what's going to be the impact on the banking system? And, you know, you have to recapitalize the banks in order to make the fallout less. So I think that a default would actually be positive for the United States if you can make sure that there's no contagion.
Okay, and could you talk a little bit more about how American institutions, financial institutions, are tied to Greece's debt?
You know, there's a CDS market. That's the credit default swap market, and that is potentially a tie to Greece. But the direct ties are not necessarily that large in terms of the amount of debt that American banks hold of Greece. So I don't think that the direct ties are really that large. It's really more about money market funds that are invested in European banks that are also invested in Greece. And so it's more of an indirect tie outside of these credit default swaps, which are basically insurance on Greek debt.
Okay, and you said earlier that a Greek default may even be a positive thing. What do you say to some out there that say such a Greek default could lead to an economic collapse that could spread throughout Europe and could spread here in the U.S.? I mean, what's your response to that fear?
Well, my response is, you know, obviously if the default is done in a messy and not believable way, it could. The reality is that Greece has a much higher debt to GDP in terms of their government debt than all of the other countries within the Eurozone. You know, Italy has 120%, Ireland has 100%, Portugal has 90%, you know, Spain has something like 70%. So those are much lower numbers. If you were to recapitalize the banks and then say that Greece is different than these other countries, and these other countries can make the grade, and you were to actually credibly backstop them in some way through the ECB, the European Bailout Fund, etc., I think then, you know, it would stop at Greece.
And the IMF, as you just mentioned, they are considering participating in the EU bailout fund. It's the first indication that the fund is playing a bigger role than previously thought. And the U.S. is a major subscriber to the IMF. They contribute over 17%. If the IMF were to bail out the Eurozone, what does that mean for taxpayers here in the U.S.? I mean, are they footing the bill for this?
Well, I'm less concerned about the U.S. footing the bill and the IMF being involved. What I'm really concerned about in terms of the bailout fund is the fact that the bailout fund itself is not necessarily credible. You know, in the United States, the interest rates are incredibly low. Our debt to GDP is equivalent to, say, France. Same thing in the UK, equivalent to France. They have very low interest rates, so do we. The French, the Italians, the Spanish, they have much higher interest rates. The reason is because it's not credible that the EFSF, that is the European Bailout Fund, can backstop those governments. The United States has a backstop in terms of the Federal Reserve. The ECB could play that role, but has chosen not to do so. So my principal concern is the fact that the EFSF, the European bailout fund, really is not a credible guarantor of the sovereign debt of all the European nations.
Okay, Edward, I'm going to switch the focus here a little bit. President Obama is promoting a series of executive orders. One of them announced this week would make it easier for homeowners to refinance their mortgages. Today, we saw he announced another executive action that would allow students to better manage their student loan debt. And the White House says this is a way to get things done quickly in a timely manner without the approval of Congress, which going that direction at this point doesn't seem to be going anywhere. How do you feel about the president now exercising his executive powers?
Well, I don't think these measures are going to be that make a huge difference. Basically, what you really need to see is credit write-downs in these of these loans that are unpayable. But the reality is if the banks start writing down specific loans to specific individuals, student loans, mortgages, then everyone's going to start wanting to get a write-down. And in truth, only a minority of the people who are underwater are going to be the ones who end up defaulting. Not everyone's going to default. So you could actually make the problem bigger by inducing everyone to try to get some sort of write-down. Really, we're sort of stuck here. There's no systemic solution to the problem.
Edward, thank you so much for your insight on all of this. That was Edward Harrison, founder of Credit Write-Downs.